So, believe it or not, there is a bit of a Brexiteer civil war going on at the moment, mostly because of the fact that if you look at everything that has gone on in the past couple of weeks, you can see why the UK should absolutely be in Europe, that it has its place in Europe, that's where it belongs, that's where its friends, that's where its closest friends and allies are. And that is where we will always find our biggest base and core of support, be it in economics, trade, defense. Why are we turning so far away from our neighbors, as the Brexiteers have long professed? And all of a sudden, you've seen this week a couple of Brexiteers, even though they haven't said it outright, almost praise the EU and European countries working together in close friendship through even, dare I say it, recommending frameworks and ideas for closer relationships and working together. Gee, if only something like that already existed. So it has caused a bit of a kerfuffle, shall we say, between those pro Brexit in the pro Brexit camp still over that. So we're going to go over someone who is aghast at that on the opposite side. However, Peter Franklin, whose article we'll be covering here, also not only has a bit of a go at another article we saw from another pro-European conservative, certainly on the Remain side of that argument, because as he also quite rightly pointed out in the article, you look at net zero stuff, the British public wants to go in that direction, that they can see the benefit of that net zero stuff, embracing that net zero opportunity, embracing that stuff. And many of the conservatives do want to go in that direction as well, but they never coalesced around into a single group or a single person. You may remember Chris Skidmore. I disagree with a lot of his other stuff politically he said, but I'll tell you what, I saw him speak at a business event I once went to, and I can tell you he gets net zero. He gets the opportunities. He gets why the UK should pursue a net zero future. I think everything else politically we would probably never agree on, but I'll tell you what, he might have been one of the authors of Britannia Unchained, but boy, does he sure get net zero, and why the Conservative Party should have pursued net zero even more doggedly than they did. But yet another interesting split going on in the Conservative faction on that point as well. So let's dip into this and find out. Peter Franklin, the editor, of course, of Unheard, Conservative Home's more weird, freaky, outlandish sister site, shall we say. And like I say, from time to time, Peter Franklin appears on Conservative Home when, he seems to sort of, shall we say, tone it down a bit. Whereas Unheard, there is just no filter indeed. And maybe we should start covering a bit more of what goes on Unheard. But like I say, they do a heck of a lot more, shall we say, weird, freaky stuff on Unheard than on Conservative Home. It's more interesting to almost respond to some of the stuff on Conservative Home than it is on Unheard, because half the time I'm just like, so yeah. Let's go on into this. So before we do that, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there is the YouTube thank you button, the Pony Club, the Buy Me Coffee link where you can buy me coffee, the all that good stuff down below, and the Pony Club as well. And it was, of course, Wednesday yesterday, so there was a new Pony Club video out. Go give that. I'm actually recording it immediately after this video, so it will be up at some point in the on the Wednesday past soon. There you go. I'm getting myself confused now with time. So, as always, thank you very much for all the support you guys show. So, let's crack on then into this. From Conservative Home by Peter Franklin, why the Trump-Putin axis does not make a case for the European Union. Really? Um, so obviously this was written yesterday, but oh no, this Trump Putin axis doesn't make a case for countries coming together at all, right? This is what is currently going on. There is a bit of a civil war emerging on the Brexiteer side of this, and it is kind of interesting on that. So, uh, of course, he starts off having a go at David Wetz, as we said. We've already covered the article. Very pro European conservative, saying that conservatives must end their neurosis on Europe. So, David Welts very politely, quote, taken me to task for an article in which I referred to the, quote, Ramona left. I do not accept that many Remainers are neither Moners nor lefties. That said, the main force of the Remain movement, as embodied by the People's Vote campaign, chose the path of conflict, attempting to overturn the biggest mandate in our history. It wasn't the fact that they were overturning that. They were like, no, we want people to have a say on Brexit again. Like you apparently originally were all for wanting that referendum, and then as soon as it happened, never allowing the people to speak again on that ever again. We all know how that worked out for them. Then, of course, this destroyed Theresa May's Brexit, only to get Boris Johnson's version installed. You now reap what you sow. So we had a lot softer Brexit into a lot harder Brexit. But as I would say back then, didn't even matter because ultimately it was the hardcore Brexiteers who destroyed Theresa May's Brexit more so than the People's Vote campaign did. Anyway, meanwhile, in America, the Democrats also failed to take the hint that voters gave them in 2016, that they used the Biden presidency to pursue hyper-liberal immigration policies while launching one culture war after another against the deplorables. The result was the unlikely comeback of Donald Trump, again sowing reaping. That's a very bad reading of what happened, honestly. The Biden presidency had a lot of very good wins. And if you want to sort of accuse someone for culture warring, hello, Donald Trump's on the line for you, my friend. He is the biggest culture war warrior over in America. The Republicans pretty much not only invented the culture war, but are the artist in general. They are the Pablo Picasso of the culture war. They are the ones who constantly fight it. But there you go. But isn't there, of course, a delicious irony to be had here? Delicious, at least, to the Remainer taste buds. With Trump now back in the White House, they are now busily deconstructing the Western alliance. Isn't this, of course, a slam dunk case for British reintegration into the European Union? It absolutely is. It absolutely is. Trump is the final nail in the coffin of Brexit. When those tariffs come in on April 2nd, oh boy, watch those Brexiteers wail and gnash their teeth. So, this certainly is a case for nations of Europe to take full responsibility for the defense, of course, of their own continent. But the very last thing we need is for the EU to lead the process, which is exactly what Ursula von der Leyen has in mind. In fact, it's hard to think of an organization less suited to the task. What? What? Oh, this is going to get good. This is going to get good. Anyway, let's begin with some basic geography. How on earth is the EU, a European institution, not good at basic geography about Europe? Let's find out, shall we? Anyway, a new defense architecture for Europe needs to involve nations that are not and most likely won't be part of the EU. So, Okay, who are those? Obviously, the UK. Obviously, as he states, there is the UK, which, along with France, is a Western Europe's only semi-serious military power. What about Poland? I keep on bringing this up. Poland is armed to the teeth. They are chomping at the bit to have a go at Russia. I seriously think if we just gave the excuse to Poland, they would go into Ukraine and intervene in Ukraine. I generally think they would do if they thought they would get serious backing. This is why I keep on talking about if we were going to intervene, it should be us, France, Germany, and Poland. And I still bring up Germany because Germany is still a serious military power. It just still needs to refine its feet on that footing. But it is still a serious military power. And to say that they're not kind of downplays really, the rest of Europe. Not only that, what about, Sweden? Another country that takes defense very seriously, as too does Finland. So a complete misreading of the militaries of Europe. Next, of course, there's Canada. Not, of course, a European country, but important to, of course, the defense of the Arctic and, of course, the GIUK gap in the North Atlantic. Well, we have Iceland that helps defend that quite a lot as well. Are you not going to bring them up into that? Turkey, of course, also deserves a mention. You don't have to be a fan of Erdogan to see how a few world leaders have more successfully frustrated Moscow's geopolitical ambitions, both in the Middle East and in the Black Sea region. Turkey is a vital counterweight to Russia. And then there's Ukraine itself. Assuming that it is not left neutered and defenseless by the Trump-Putin stitch-up, no nation today has had more experience of resisting Russia's military might. In short, the EU isn't big enough. So why then can't the EU, as it is doing now, and other countries work together to do that? The idea that, the EU isn't going to go, oh, well, actually, getting, Turkey, UK, and Canada involved in, defense agreements. Why would they not? You do make a good point on that, but why is the EU not going to get also involved in with them as well? Just anyway, that is a ridiculous argument, an absolutely ridiculous argument. If you want to defend Europe, then absolutely, the UK should be involved in those discussions. And if you want to make it wider, which absolutely you should care, then yeah, why not bring in Canada? Canada's going to have suddenly a lot more minerals that it wants to probably sell to a European market, thanks to all those Trump tariffs. And Turkey, you are right. Why not get Turkey involved in it as well? It's a NATO member. Then the past weekend has shown that pretty much the UK led on a lot of these international talks. We even had, was it France's, I think, defense or foreign minister actually praised Britain for this. I mean, that is just such a ridiculous argument. In short, the EU isn't big enough. It is very big. The point is, as Keir Starmer made, it's a coalition of the willing that must be brought up and made for that defense. And I still think those key countries are the UK, France, Germany, and Poland. I think it is up to those four countries to really start looking at our defense. And I'm not that I'm, missing out any other countries as well, but those are the ones that have the biggest spending when it comes to defense, the size when it comes to sort of the army. And again, I'm not dismissing Sweden out of this because Sweden absolutely takes its defense very seriously. Why then can these countries still not work together, even if it is under an EU framework? Size has nothing to do with this. Size is a stupid argument to make on this, a very stupid argument to make. And then there's the opposite problem in the shape of EU countries that aren't NATO. Members that, of course, maintain an official stance, of course, of neutrality. Austria, Ireland, and Malta. How can the EU lead on defense on Europe when it has a member states that are literally on the side? Yeah, they will still remain on the side. That is why even then you can have countries that will say we will remain neutral and take a neutral stance, but we will still help you and contribute in that way. If they don't want to be involved, then they won't be involved. It makes even more sense then to pursue those talks with the UK, Canada, and Turkey. It's like again, those two arguments are ridiculous, but there you go. Anyway, David Wells does argue that the assumption that the EU is a socialist project. You may be surprised to know that I am in agreement with him there. Indeed, the idea that EU exemplifies progressive politics is a kind of laughable. Have we forgotten what the European Central Bank did to the Greeks? The big Brexiteer gotcha. Oh, we would never want to happen what happened to the Greeks. Anyway, and just look at the rise of right-wing populism across the continent. As a remarkable chart from The Economist shows, various parties that comprise the European hard right have now a higher share of the votes than any other political family, whether conservative, social democrat, socialist, liberal, or green. There is no sign of that populist wave abating, except, of course, when you take Poland into the account. But, they don't like to mention Poland because, all of a sudden Poland starts booking a lot of trends in Europe that these guys don't like to bring up. But there you go. And it should be said that this category is, of course, a very mixed bag that does include some ardent Atlanticists, like Italy's Giorgia Meloni. And, well, again, Giorgia Meloni is probably in a very hard place because you look at some of the polls, they don't like her stance. Italy at the moment, that I believe she's taken on this, doesn't like that at all. But then there is also a very vociferous anti-NATO element too, such as Germany's ADF, which has celebrated its best ever election results. And yeah, it took a big beating. If you look at some of the stuff, there's a lot of these parties that are pro-Putin friendly or anti some of the stuff that they've been really against, and they've taken a bit of a beating on some of that stuff. And in some EU countries, some Putin-friendly politicians are already in power. Just look at Viktor Orban in Hungary, who voted with Russia and the US against Ukraine at the United Nations. And yeah, you don't have to involve them in this. You don't have to involve them in this. You can still work with and outside the EU. And if the EU wants to do stuff that makes it easier for these countries to work together, then yeah, so be it. Why not? The case, though, is for these EU countries and European countries working together. And to do that, you need frameworks, you need ideas, you need things that make it easier for these countries to work together. One of the biggest things we saw in the run-up to the EU referendum was that whole, oh my God, this bill's going to create an EU army. Never did. What it created was a central command structure so that armies could work together on joint training exercises. That's all it was. That was it. That's all it did. That's all that bill did. It did not create an EU army. But that was good. That was good. That did, strengthen, European navy armies, because that idea then led to a camp that currently operates in Poland, where NATO members and Ukrainians come together, and the Ukrainians teach other NATO members what they are learning about the drone war currently going on in Ukraine. That could not have happened if it wasn't for that initial bill. Just saying. Worth remembering on that. So, as this tendency grows now in strength and influence, how can EU institutions be treated, or sorry, at least be trusted to lead the struggle against Russian subversion and outright aggression? Remember, what about, when, a certain British individual voted against an EU idea that would have helped stop that? Are we gonna talk about that? Anyway, remember, of course, key opposition bodies like the European Commission, the European Council, and Council of Ministers are, of course, divided up or even rotated between all member states. For the moment, the old EU establishment is still in control, but a consensus-shattering event like the election of Marine Le Pen as president of France or the collapse of the German firewall against the ADF can no longer be ruled out. And here's the thing. If either of those two gets in, look what happened in Poland. The Peace and Justice Party built up just like Marine Le Pen, the ADF did. They got in. They ruled for over a decade, and it did not end well for them because everyone finally realized, oh, these guys don't have a clue. And now their party barely exists. It cannot get 2 euros together to rub together to help defend them against in all those corruption cases and cases being brought against them. Yes, those like Marie Le Pen and the ADF might do a lot of damage, but in the process, they would show that their populism was just all talk. They would not be good. They would very quickly find themselves out of office. Very quickly. So anyone, of course, looking to the EU to be a bulwark against Trumpism is badly underestimated the danger now of Euro-Trumpism. The EU is a big bulwark against Trumpism. Big bulwark against Trumpism, because Marie Le Pen, ADF, they ain't leaving the EU. Because they've seen what happened and what Brexit did to the UK. They ain't leaving. You look at those countries, but in Germany, in France, the EU is still very, very, very favorable. Do you think if they wanted to run a referendum, they'd win? Given how the EU is favorable in those countries, I don't think they would. I don't think they would win at all. So even if the EU as we know it survives, its record does not inspire confidence. Don't forget that Putin's forces started seizing Ukrainian territory in 2014. And yeah, that is a big black mark, not only just against the EU, but all European countries. This was, of course, followed by Donald Trump's first term, in which he made his long-term intentions abundantly clear. Unfortunately, the EU responded with a lamentable lack of urgency. Trump's big demand that European nations meaningfully increase their defense spending. This was largely ignored. Well, actually, it ultimately wasn't. Some countries did increase their defense spending. 2% at the time was the asking. A lot of countries did do that. So again, largely ignored is not true. Then the 2022 invasion, of course, was a very wake-up moment. But it took the British action now to shame the French and Germans into arming Ukraine. It wasn't so much that we shamed them, it was the fact that we went, we're going to lead the way and we're going to show you Vladimir Putin is all talk. Because remember, giving him certain weapons was meant to be a moment where he dropped a nuke. Time and time again, we've walked well past all those red lines where he was meant to drop a nuke. So it was more, I would say, bravery to risk that and show that Vladimir Putin was all talk. So as for the EU sanction regime, it has been leakier than the Russian pipeline. It only has to look at, of course, the spike of European exports, the countries that just happen to border Russia, to see what's going on. As for all those expressions, again, does need to be looked at. And this isn't just a European Union problem. That's other countries' problems as well that they need to sort. Like our own sanction regime has this very similar problem. I don't see you criticizing that sanction regime. So, as for all those expressions of solidarity that Zelensky, of course, received from various European leaders, they're, of course, lovely. But confiscating Putin's shadow fleet of oil tankers would be lovelier and not before time. Well, that is very difficult to do. Very difficult to do because of the paperwork involved, who actually owns it. That world is incredibly murky. And believe it or not, it would take an institution like the EU to put an end to something like that. That needs a combined European effort to do that. No one country can just take care of that shadow fleet. It will take a combined European push, but it is a very murky world indeed to try and track some of that stuff. But it would take a united front on that. So, admittedly, the EU isn't famous for fast moving on anything, much to the frustration of its most ardent federalists. But there is a serious impediment to an effective policy of, course, rearmament. None of this is more obvious than the respect now to nuclear deterrence. If America folds up its nuclear umbrella, who will replace it? Last month, a Belgian MEP called on France to transfer its deterrent to the European Union. Emmanuel Macron should place the French force of Villafleur in the European hands, just as Helmut Kohl put the Deutschmark in European hands. Probably not. Probably not. Like I say, France isn't going to do that, but extending the nuclear umbrella is an idea that both we and France should consider if America does remove its nuclear umbrella. And we can do that. So if France were minded to, of course, make such a gesture, which they absolutely wouldn't be, how would a common nuclear policy actually work? Well, a common nuclear policy wouldn't work unless the EU actually became a proper federalized country. That's why that idea was not, shall we say, entertained at all. And you can probably find lots of random comments from MEPs saying, stuff like that from many different things. But it isn't going to. A common nuclear policy would only work if the EU actually became a single country with a common foreign and defense policy. But that ain't there at the moment. So even saying, well, how would this work? Well, it could work if the EU was one country. But right now, ain't going to work. So would the red button, of course, be controlled by the qualified majority voting? Or would it rotate from member state to member state on a 6-monthly basis? Perhaps Macron could just give the codes to Ursula and then hope for the best. Well, that ain't going to happen. That is ridiculous. That's not how a nuclear deterrent, a common nuclear policy, would work. It just wouldn't work at all. Obviously, none of that's going to happen. Then why even bring it up? Why even bring it up? But the underlying question does need an answer. Without the Americans are, of course, breaking the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, how does Europe get covered? Us and France extend our nuclear umbrella. Easy. Easy. That's how it's done. It's simply done like that. It's incredibly easy. And guess what? In that regard, you don't need the EU to do that. But it is again showing us where our friends and allies are. And if we are working together so well with Europe, this sort of undermines, once again, the big argument by the Brexiteers that the Europeans weren't our friends or allies. Anyway, Friedrich Merz, the incoming German Chancellor, has, of course, been giving it some thought, he continues. His suggestion was that his countries and others could share a nuclear deterrent with France and or Britain. This would be much more compatible with the British than the French nuclear doctrine. Therefore, if the US definitively turned its back on Europe, Brexit Britain is A, the likeliest plan, B, it would be an atomic backstop, if you will. But would such a role be in our national interest? Yes, but only if certain conditions were agreed to. Yes, it is absolutely in our national interest. And I'm going to see what on earth these conditions would be, he's asking for. So, first, he asked for that any such agreement would only cover a coalition of the genuinely willing, no time wasters or fair weather friends. I think those countries would be obviously be, very willing if they were asking to be covered by a nuclear umbrella. So that's a foolish ask to begin with anyway. Secondly, the cost should be shared as appropriate. Okay, fine. You want paying for that? I think that's a reasonable ask. You're under the nuclear umbrella. You should contribute something to it. Fine. That's a fair ask. Thirdly, that this shared umbrella is not used as an alternative to conventional rearmament. I think it's very obvious Europe knows more than ever, even at the time of writing this, that, yeah, they need to rearm. Fourthly, that the EU's security and defense policy should go back to being a standalone organization, that it was as in the days of the Western European Union, with full membership not dependent on EU membership. Well, that's up to the EU, but that has nothing to do with this extending of the nuclear umbrella. So that's pointless. Fifth, and of course, the most commitment to, of course, high defense spending should go hand in hand with cooperation on industrial strategy. Namely, as Nick Timothy has argued, that Europe cannot afford rearmament unless it supports and is supported by a policy of reindustrialization. Rebuilding your industrial strategy as every country. This is why this guy has not been paying attention to these conversations, and he's just not qualified to really be talking about this stuff. And from someone like me, who is an amateur and who takes an interest in this type of stuff, you look at what all these countries have been saying. We need to rebuild our capacity. That means exactly that reindustrialization, rebuilding their capacity. But if you're going to maybe, I don't know, do that again, then maybe once again, this is where the UK should rejoin the Single Market Customs Union, because it looks foolish if you are going to be building military stuff to common NATO standards, but you, for some reason, do not want to participate or even slow down the shipping of these vital supplies. You want to cooperate them when it comes to defense, but everything else suddenly you have no interest in. It looks very weird, very weird. And this is why there has been such a split. There is a bit of a Brexit friction civil war going on here on that one. So, how this coalition of the willing would relate to NATO, of course, depends on what's left of it. But even if Trump does take the US out of that treaty altogether, Britain must endeavor to hold the door open for American re-involvement. Yes, because Trump may not be there forever. However, maybe we get another Biden type. Maybe you get another Trump type. Maybe you keep on just constant flipping all the time. Is there any point, how shall we say, just opening a constant revolving door as to one president goes into NATO, the next one takes it back in, back out, back in, back out, back in, back out. This is what we talk about when we say that America is now an unreliable partner, especially under Trump. But these are, of course, dark days, and there is probably, of course, worse to come. Yet we must not abandon all hope. As Hezri Olsen explains in the New York Post, Trump's voters broadly sympathize with Ukraine in its conflict with Russia. And at some point, the White House may also take notice that 90% of the US military and related aid to Ukraine benefits the American industry. It is also worth noting that not long before the bust-up with Zelensky, Trump mused about getting back the occupied portion of the Black Sea coast for Ukraine. That is absolutely, of course, no guarantee. Well, sorry, but already that's a non-starter from Russia because Russia has basically said it ain't giving up any of its occupied territory and wants territory that it currently does not occupy. Like I say, these negotiations, when they really start, oh boy, we'll see what happens. But back to this. One, of course, last glimmer is that when AJ Partners did ask Americans who their country's biggest ally is, 43% of Americans said Britain, only 6% said Russia. The Western Alliance is not yet gone. Their own country might just be the glue that holds it together. Well, that may be the case for most Americans, but what about the Republican Party? What about the people in control over that? Like I say, I'm absolutely silly, but some of this stuff that he puts down is ridiculous. Countries and EU countries can work together on defense. We are doing that right now. If the EU wants to get involved, so be it. But that means, as it said, it's going to have to make exceptions if it wants other countries to be involved. And there should be other countries that should be involved. You will probably see the European Union reach out its hands to those countries like Turkey, the UK, in this regard. It is inevitable. And if not, we can still work with Germany. We can still work with France in that regard. But eventually, push comes to shove, and you realize when we have to get these critical materials or components for this stuff, if it's coming from Europe, you are slowing it down on purpose by still wanting to maintain yourself out of like single market or even the customs union or even both. So it makes that reindustrialization harder. If you want reindustrialization, we got to go back into the EU. Anyway, should we? It's been a long one on this one. Shall we go into the comments? No, we'll not. No, well, not today. But yeah, the comments in this one are interesting. You can go and look for them yourself on this one. But yeah, Peter Franklin. I think his arguments there quite ridiculous. I think the only reasonable argument he had was that if we were to extend the nuclear umbrella, a reasonable ask might be some form of upkeep. It would be a reasonable request to ask even if a country like Lithuania or etc. said no, we should still extend that nuclear umbrella. We should absolutely still extend it. But it is a reasonable ask to ask for some sort, I think, of payment for that, deterrent. I think it's a reasonable ask, but if a country says no, that should not be the thing that stops them from still extending that nuclear umbrella. But as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, let me know what you think down in the comments. It's been another long one today. So as always, we'll see you all next time.